Happy Friday, Wildcats. This is our first lecture looking into the individual battles that were fought during the American Civil War. For today, we're going to break down the fighting into different regions. We're going to look at the fighting that takes place in the east to begin the war. Then we'll go out west. 9 slides today. We'll finish up our unit over the Civil War next week as we get ready to wrap up the school year next Friday on the 22nd of May. How exciting! So let's jump right into this bad boy. The other day we talked about Fort Sumter, which was the official starting of the American Civil War. It takes place in April of 1861. Shortly after that event, Mr. Lincoln, or I should call him President Lincoln, is rushing for a call to arms to start outfitting a Union army. Fighting is going to be relatively slow in regards to how quickly we get back to battle after Fort Sumter. It's going to take us several months until we have our next engagement here in Manassas/Bull Run in Virginia, and I'll explain that very quickly. So after the Confederate States of America moved their capital from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia, President Lincoln just wants to go directly at Richmond, Virginia, take down their capital, and end this war as quickly as possible. And as we can see, we have Washington, D.C., and the Confederate States. We are going to focus right over here for the first slide about Bull Run in Manassas. As we kind of go through this, there's different names given to the battles depending on which side you're rooting for or a part of. If you are cheering on the Union of the United States of America, they usually define their battles by the nearest body of water, so like creeks, rivers, while the Confederate States of America really named theirs after the closest town. So the first major battle of the Civil War was the First Battle of Bull Run, and it was won by the South. This was a kind of a cluster of nonsense and a mess in regards to the battle tactics. As the Union tries to get ready for this battle that's going to be led by General Irvin McDowell, he's very hesitant in leaving Washington, D.C., where they are training at. A lot of his recruits are new, and they don't know what they're doing. But also Lincoln is feeling pressured because as he called for all these arms, the enlistment was only 90 days, thinking that this would be a very fast battle. With news that a battle is taking place here at Bull Run, citizens all across the East Coast to kind of start flocking to this battleground. You have some of the wealthy and elite loading up their carriages. They're packing picnic baskets and they're bringing their picnic blanket and they're going to the battlefield so they can actually sit and watch the first battle fought in the American Civil War. While they get there, they get to watch a bunch of confusion. The other day we kind of looked at our PowerPoint, and the Union is known for wearing those blue uniforms, while the Confederate States of America, or those rebels, are known to be wearing their gray. At the time of this battle, everyone was wearing pretty much whatever they had, and you had, friendly fire taking place. This battle takes roughly all day. There's fighting that starts at 4 in the morning, and it doesn't get done till late in the afternoon. So basically, it's a lot of back and forth throughout the entire war. The Union's going to have more troops, but at the start of it, they're not as trained. But thankfully for them, they're able to start forcing the Confederates to lose ground and retreat just a little bit until this man named General Jackson appears, who is leading a group of Virginians, and he is taking the high ground, and as the rest of the rebels are falling back, he is standing there, as one general said, as a stone wall. and kind of made all the Confederate soldiers kind of rally around that. Also during this battle, we see the rebel yell, which is used throughout the war, and basically it's when they're going to yell like furies. So the Battle of Bull Run, was won by the South. It was a mess. There was confusion everywhere. I think the worst part is that as the Union was starting to retreat, some artillery was fired at them, which caused a lot of the younger troops to actually run all the way from Manassas or Bull Run back to safety in Washington, D.C., as they try to beat the traffic or the other individuals that came to watch out of town. Shortly after, Mr. Lincoln and the North realized that this isn't going to be as easy as they thought it. They're going to have to figure out who is going to lead the who's going to lead the army, since his first choice, Mr. Robert E. Lee, refused to take that position and decided to go and kind of defend his homeland of Virginia. This Bull Run's going to do wonders for the South. They felt like this is going to be over quickly because they don't want to keep suffering these large defeats. So everyone's kind of shook if you're in the North and really happy if you're down in the South. So watching Mr. McDowell struggle during that first Bull Run, President Lincoln is going to go ahead and switch up his commander to a 30-something-year-old named George McClellan. He was kind of the most well-known individual in the military at this time. However, a lot of the leadership roles within Washington, D.C. weren't crazy about him. He thought that he was, full of himself and had a pretty large ego. But he is going to be leading the main part of the Union Army, which was the Army of the Potomac, named after the river in Washington, D.C., in which he's going to have at his hands about 100,000 troops. As I said, the rebel command is going to go to General Robert E. Lee, who decides that he's not going to lead the Union and is going to fight for his homeland. He is going to take control of a much smaller army, about 40 to 60,000 troops, in regards to the Army of Northern Virginia. The next battle we're going to talk about is a battle that takes place over the course of like 7 days in 7 different locations. It is called the the 7 Days Battle. Basically, this is Robert E. Lee going up against the Army of the Potomac, in which he's trying to force the Union out of Virginia to protect the capital of Richmond. It starts, I believe, in June 25th, and it gets over in July 1st of 1861. The first one takes place at the Battle of Mechanicsville. Mr. Lee decides that he was going to divide his force, which is, not recommended since he is so outnumbered. He realized that that did not work. In that process, he loses 1,500 men. The next battle goes to the Battle of the Gaines Mill, and the rest of the battles that takes place in those 7 days are going to be victories for the South. So even though they lose that first battle, they're going to win the rest of the battle and eventually the entire 7-day. So really this was used to continue to push the Union troops away from the capital of Richmond, Virginia. Now, after having some big-time victories in the South defending Richmond, Virginia, Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis are looking to switch it up a little bit. They're looking to gain more momentum by not only defending their homeland in the South, but they want to go take the fighting up to the North, in which he's going to lead part of his Northern Virginia Army up north to invade Maryland. The idea here was not only were we going to march and take the fighting up in the north, but as we go into these border states such as Maryland, we want to kind of rally the citizens in the area to back their ideology and to support the movement. So on his way up, into Maryland. He fights the Second Battle of Bull Run, in which the Union loses again, and turns its attention to Maryland. While he is advancing to Maryland, there was a military order that the Confederate troops had left, and it was discovered by the Union troops that kind of laid out their plan in regards to going into Maryland attacking. The Union, who usually works a little slowly during this time, decides that they are going to act on this information to try to make sure they are going to stop the progression of the Confederate troops moving their way up north and trying to attack Washington, D.C. So this is the bloodiest Battle of Antietam. It takes place in one calendar day in September of 1862. The fighting goes on the entire day. It is broken down really into 4 different sections in regards to the fighting that takes place. Let me look at my notes real quick. Because the first fighting takes place in a cornfield in which the Union is going to go up against, Stonewall Jackson again. There is, back and forth, but eventually it will be a stalemate here in the cornfield. The next fighting takes place in the West Woods over here, in which the Union gets destroyed. Following that, there is a battle at the Sunken Road, also known as the Bloody Lane, due to all of the blood that was shed during this time. The Union is going to find it, very easy to take control of this territory, forcing the Confederate troops to retreat. And then the last one takes place at Burnside Bridge, at which it takes the Union roughly 3 attempts before they're able to successfully take over the bridge. By doing so, they are going to really force Mr. Lee and his troops to fall back, and eventually getting back to safety in Virginia. This is the bloodiest day of the Civil War. There is roughly 23,000 individuals that were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner of war. Shortly after this victory, the tide is going to start to turn. President Lincoln now has the full support of the Union behind him after this major battle here at Antietam or at Vicksburg. It also stops the idea of the Confederacy trying to march north and take over Washington, D.C. It also really puts an end to the Confederates' opportunity to receive foreign help. But to kind of push the Confederate a little bit more, Mr. Lincoln is going to give his Emancipation Proclamation in September 22nd, 1862. Basically, this is just stating that if you do not return these Confederate states to the United States of America, then we are going to free all of the slaves in the Confederate States of America, effectively January 1st of 1863. So the big thing here is that the start of the Civil War begins with the idea of preserving and saving the Union with his proclamation, and now turns into freeing the slaves in the Confederate States. The big thing about this is that it's really focusing on the slaves in the Confederate States of America. We do not want to touch the slaves in those border states because they are providing us, that buffer between the Union and the Confederate States, but also they have the resources that the Union needs to be able to be successful. Really, we start to see an uptick of free African Americans that are going to flock to sign up for the American Civil War. Frederick Douglass was really big on trying to get the African Americans to fight. He has a lot of famous quotes during this time. The question will be asked to him, it's like, would the slave fight? He said no, but an African American would. and that there's three things that are going to be coming for these African Americans. It's going to be the cartridge box of weapons and ammunition. The second is the jury box to go and have rights. And number three is the ballot box, be able to vote. So Frederick Douglass and a lot of these abolitionists felt that this is going to be an opportunity for the free blacks living in the United States to show what they're worth, and eventually get those equal rights that were stated in the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that all men are created equal. Shortly after, we're going to see the formation of African American regiments throughout the United States. The most progressive during this time would be Massachusetts. Their governor was a big abolitionist individual. He wanted to have the first African American regiment for the United States. They're going to form three regiments. They're going to form the 54th, the 55, and I believe it was the 5th, which was a cavalry unit. The 54th is probably the most famous. There is a movie back in the day called Glory that kind of stars Denzel Washington and was it Samuel L. Jackson, I believe, or was it Morgan Freeman? No, but if you want to go watch a war movie, you go ahead and watch Glory. So you had hundreds of these African Americans flocking to sign up, about 1,000 young men. They're not all coming from Boston or Massachusetts because they're not a large free population. So these individuals are going to come through all across the United States. They're going to come from Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania. You're even going to have some free blacks make their way down from Canada. During this time, as they're getting ready to train, their officers or their leading commanders are going to be white. The officials or the officers weren't crazy about it. They didn't know what African Americans could actually do, so they were hesitant about leading the 54th. But eventually, through training, they shows that they were capable, if not more, compared to the white soldier fighting in this war. They're going to take place in a handful of battles throughout Charleston, South Carolina. They're going to be part of Grimble's. Can't find my notes. Grimble's Hill, but also he's going to be famous for the second battle at Fort Wagner, which is what the movie Glory is kind of centered around. It's kind of about how they were going into this death trap, and then a soldier, Sergeant William Canary, was the individual that kind of went up to the fort amongst the fighting to display the American flag. In return, he did get a Medal of Honor. So the 54th is the most famous African American regiment that fought during the American Civil War. Side 6, excuse me. Sorry, I got my allergies pumping through me today. We're going to look at fighting out in the West. And we'll wrap this up here in a bit. So with the fighting going on in the East, with the Army of the Potomac being led by McClellan, Ulysses S. Grant, or General Grant, is going to make his way to the kind of the Mississippi Valley. If we think back, the Union's plan is the Indocana plan, in which they want to kind of suffocate the South in regards to blockading the Gulf of Mexico in the eastern coast, as we see with this map. But also, we want to take over take over the Mississippi River, so it cuts the Confederate States in half and separates them, like Texas, from the rest of the Confederacy. The battle we're going to talk about is the Battle of Shiloh that takes place April 6, 1862 in Tennessee. It's going to be fought over the course of 2 days. Grant was one of the most gifted commanders that the Union had, a lot better compared to McDowell and McClellan, and he is going to put his reputation up to task. On the first day of fighting, there was back and forth in regards to momentum and land gained throughout the battle. Eventually, later on that afternoon, Grant decides that he was going to retreat. He's going to give up space and give up time, because later on that night, he was going to be hit with reinforcements making their way. The next day, with the reinforcements, they attack, kind of early throughout the morning. The battle rages throughout the course of the day, eventually forcing the Confederacy to retreat. Throughout this battle, it's believed that the Union Army had around 66,000 troops versus the 40 to 45,000 Confederates. By the end of the 2 days of fighting, the Union had suffered 13,000 casualties, including 1,700 dead. The Confederates suffered 10,000 casualties and 1,700 dead as well. So shortly after we take Shiloh, which is one of the major victories here in the Mississippi Valley, we continue our march down south to eventually take over other important cities along the Mississippi River. Shortly after, the Union is going to take over the port city of New Orleans. The Battle of New Orleans takes place April 24th to the 25th in 1862. It was mostly a naval action by the Union forces, which seek to capture this city during the American Civil War. The Navy squad had about 43 ships that entered the lower Mississippi near New Orleans and soon breached the heavy chain cables that were stretched across the river as a prime defense for the Confederacy. Realizing that their resistance was useless, the Confederate decides that they are going to withdraw their 3,000 troops northward, and the city is going to fall on the 25th of April. On May 1st, the Union general is going to lead 15,000 troops to the city to take command for the remainder of the war. The permanent loss of New Orleans was considered one of the worst disasters suffered by the Confederacy in the Western theater throughout the war. And as I said, the Union Navy of 43 ships kind of makes its way past two forts protecting the harbor. They had those chains across to kind of stop the movement of the ships, but that doesn't work out. With this victory, it really secures the idea that the Union now controls the Mississippi River and the Mississippi Valley. Last battle, shall we? Mr. Grant, after taking care of the Mississippi Valley, is going to turn his attention to Vicksburg, Mississippi. Which was being defended by a 200-foot cliff above the Mississippi River. The goal throughout this battle was simple. Grant realizes that they had higher ground, and the only way that they were going to be successful is that if they laid siege to the city. We talked about laying siege to the city roughly starting or dating back to the American Revolution, so we begin to lay siege just shortly after arriving to the battle, May 18th, 1863, in which we are going to really surround the city, so they are no longer to get supplies in and out. Remember that we're not just laying siege to the military of the Confederacy, but we're also laying siege to the city of the citizens in there. While the city is being laid, surrounded or sieged, it's going to be bombed a few days. Eventually, the food is going to become extremely low. There are stories about the citizens going to have to eat their horses or dogs. A lot of stories about the individuals living there are going to turn to eating rats. Eventually, due to the terrible conditions that not only the Confederate is going through, but also the citizens, they decide that they are going to surrender over Vicksburg on April 4th of 1863. The Confederate had enough. The general is going to surrender to Grant. The result of the siege of Vicksburg was a victory, a great victory for the Union. It gave control of the Mississippi River to the Union. Around the same time, the Confederate Army under Robert E. Lee was defeated at the Battle of Gettysburg, which we'll get to next week. And these two victories are going to be seen as a turning point. So to recap, we went through the Battle of Bull Run on Manassas, which we see Stonewall Jackson get his nickname. The 7-day battle, which Robert E. Lee chases away the Union from its capital of Richmond. We get into the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War at Antietam, with 23,000 either killed, wounded, or missing in action, a prisoner of war. The proclamation that sets the slaves free, September 22nd, 1862. The formation of the 54th Massachusetts, the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee, the capture of New Orleans, and then the surrender of Vicksburg. In regards to our battles for today, we're gonna wrap up our battles next week. We'll take 2 more days of notes, and then we'll get ready for a weird but fun summer break. So have a good day. I know this wasn't my best effort, but I tried. Have a great day. Bye bye.